All right, so I don't want to take too much of everybody's extra time. So it's 5 past, so I think we'll try to start. Um, and so we'll just get going now. So welcome to this panel on reporting on orphan children. This is the third in a series of webinars about early childhood reporting that are part of the Early Childhood Journalism Initiative at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University. And this initiative is possible thanks to the support of several international foundations, including the Bernard van Leer Foundation in the Netherlands, the Maria Cecilia Souto Vidigal Foundation in Brazil, and the Two Lilies Fund in the US. We had a first webinar that looked at the mental health of infants and caregivers, and a second one that looked at migration from the angle of early childhood. I will leave a link later in the chat so that you can go back and watch them again. And we have 2 more webinars coming up on the climate crisis and finally on how to report on diverse families, pushing past stereotypes in our reporting. So I will also leave a link to the Dart Center's social networks so that you can find out about the upcoming dates. For those of you who are joining us live, we'll have space at the very end for questions. I also know there is some guests now that are listening, including Wana Sandu, one of the reporters who are actually working also on the issues of orphans. So we'll also get their insights at the end of this panel. And in the meantime, you can also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. It's a very cozy group, so it'd be lovely to know where you're from and where you work. And as for myself, I'm Irene Caselli, and I'll be your host and moderator tonight. I've been a journalist for 20 years. I used to be a foreign correspondent in Latin America. And then 5 years ago, I started working on early childhood. First, I was a staff writer at The Correspondent, and now I have my own newsletter that is called The First 1000 Days. And I also collaborate with the Dart Center's Early Childhood Journalism Initiative. I'm connecting from outside of Athens in Greece. And if you see me moving around a lot as we talk, it's because I'm 8 months pregnant and I can't really sit still anymore. So excuse the movement. And now in alphabetical order, these are our guests for tonight. We have Lucero Ascarza, who's a reporter at Peru's investigative health site Salud con Lupa, where she won a National Journalism Prize in the written reportage category for growing up without parents, the orphan children of the pandemic. She has a bachelor in journalism and also works as a teaching assistant at the Communication Sciences Department of the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. Hello, Lucero, and she's connecting from Lima, Peru. Then we have Maitri Ramesh, a multimedia journalist with 5 years of experience. She's reported across Indian cities and is committed to telling stories of women, children, and members of the queer community. She has reported and produced short documentaries on sensitive issues like child sexual abuse, rape, stalking, among others. And over the last 18 months, she's been reporting on the impact of COVID-19 on women and children for India's digital news platform, The Quint. And she's connecting from Delhi in India. And then we have Dr. Charles Zina, who's a professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at the Tulane University School of Medicine in New Orleans. He also directs the Tulane Institute of Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health. Throughout his career, he studied the effects of adverse early experiences on development, including trauma, abuse, and neglect. He's also studied interventions designed to enhance recovery following exposure to adverse experience and published widely on these topics. He's the editor of 4 editions of the Handbook of Infant Mental Health, and with Charles Nelson and Nathan Fox, he's the co-author of Romania's Abandoned Children, Deprivation, Brain Development, and the Struggle for Recovery. He's a distinguished life fellow of both the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and the American Psychiatric Association. and disconnected from New Orleans in the US. So why do we need a webinar dedicated to how we cover orphanhood? There are different estimates at the moment of how much COVID-19 has impacted families. It is believed that between 8 and 10.5 million children worldwide have lost a parent or caregiver during COVID-19. Mortality of parents and other caregivers was higher among Black and Latinx families in the US and families living in poverty worldwide. But of course, there are other issues that create orphanhood: wars, the climate crisis, migration. They all threaten a child's family dynamics. So the question today is, how does losing a parent or caregiver impact a child's health, and what are the possible ways to protect them in the future? And this is relevant to us journalists who try to understand how to cover better childhood so that we can do a better job when covering such an important and impactful issue. So I want to start today's webinar by going to our expert to start with. And Charles, I'd like you to start by telling us what happens when a young child loses a parent or a caregiver and becomes orphaned. How does that affect a developing brain? And how can we understand sort of the overall impact of such a traumatic event? And you're muted.
As you said, you would think after all these months, you wouldn't have to say that anymore. So the first thing that I think is important is the distinction between the so-called single orphan and double orphan, children who lose a parent but remain in their family, versus children who really have no parents or have no parents able to care for them and have to be in some alternative care arrangement. Those are two very different groups and very different experiences for children. There's a large psychiatric literature on loss of a parent in early childhood having long-term health and mental health consequences later. But as you might imagine, much depends on the caregiving that's available to the child after the loss of the parent. So the presence of loving and attentive caregivers to that child after the loss of the parent will substantially buffer them from long-term ill effects. There may be increased risk, but nevertheless, it's hugely different than children who lose a parent, do not have adequate caregiving available, and begin a trajectory that leads them towards maladaptive outcomes much later on. For children who essentially either have no parents or have no parents capable of caring for them, or children who've been abandoned by their parents and are in alternative care, the same sort of rule applies. That is, the caregiving environment that they're placed in has very substantial effects on their long-term environment. So for children who are placed in suboptimal care, either with kin placements or formal foster care arrangements, or especially institutional care that's problematic, we know that those children are at very substantially increased risk for developmental problems across the whole range of developmental outcomes, in part because the earliest years of life are so critical for the developing brain.
Thank you, Charles. And we'll come back to this, of course. You know, as I mentioned in the introduction, you were also part of the famous Romania study. So there's so much that you gathered from that. And Juana is from Romania, so it will be interesting to also touch on that later. But, you know, you were discussing the caregiving environment and how important the environment is in terms of what happens to an orphan child. So that's why I want to go to Lucero and then Maitri to get a sense of what happened in two of the countries that somehow were most affected by COVID-19. And I'll come to you, Lucero, first, because Peru was actually one of the world's most affected countries per capita, meaning that with 1 out of every 50 children lost a caregiver during the pandemic. Can you tell us a bit about how your experience reporting on this was, and when it became clear that this was a huge issue to be covering in Peru?
Well, first, yes, it was known that the situation in Peru was critical in July of 2021. But at the beginning of that year, we thought that the number of orphan children were 10,000. And that number was high for us. That was a moment where these news were shared in international media. It was a scandal to think of 10,000. But then only months later, we realized that reality was even worse. So it became very important to us to cover this reality in a depth way, because most of the media here in Peru focused on the number and only on the number, and trying to get the government to do something. Well, the government had announced by that time financial aid for the families. And we wanted to know not only how many people were getting that financial aid, what difficulties they were facing in that request, but also what was happening with the families in which that had been affected by this grief. And what Dr. Sina says, it's very close to what I saw in the families I spoke with. I saw children who were, as their parents said, as their caregiver said, actually, behaving in a different way they did before, after losing their dads, their moms. They were being, as they said, difficult in a school. They didn't want to go. They didn't want to attend the classes. Let's remember that the classes were virtual in that time, so it was already a difficult situation for the children in that moment, because they were away from their friends. They weren't socializing with much people besides their families. So losing a parent, even worse, losing both parents, having to move to a different home, because most of them had to move because of economic reasons, or because they had to live with their grandparents, for example. There was a lot of change and a lot of loss in their surroundings. So they were behaving different. I remember there were cases even when they were showing symptoms of what they thought were different sicknesses. For example, head hurts, stomach hurts. One girl, one teenager actually was experiencing attacks, like if she had epilepsy attacks. They thought she had something wrong. They made a lot of exams to figure out what she had. And in the end, the doctors could only say it was from the grief. It was a manifestation of the grief, because there was nothing wrong in her analysis, in the exams they made to her. Things started to getting better with her when she received psychological attention, actually. So it was a very difficult situation for a lot of families. And I think it was hidden somehow, because we were saying, no, Peru is one of the most affected countries by death. But I think it was slow. It was a reality that didn't sink in at first, that the result of that death was also orphan children. It didn't sink in at first. But when it did, it started to be a topic of discussion, especially in academic groups. I am not so sure that in the population it has synced as a as a topic that we need to discuss, and that is a problem that we are going to face for years and years on, because those children are growing up and they are going to be facing different trouble that they shouldn't have. It's a generation. It's a complete generation marked by that loss and that grief. We've spoken with different psychologists who has told us that this should be faced in schools also, but we hadn't seen that yet. We haven't seen schools talking about grief, talking about loss with their students. It's still a preoccupation for us as a country.
And Maitri, I'll come to you in a second, but Lucero, can you maybe just address briefly what happened in Peru? I mean, from what you were telling me, most children somehow were taken care of by other family members. This is who stepped in, and what kind of issues also that came with.
Yes, well, for example, there were some children that already live only with their mom, because there was an absent dad, for example, and they had to move to live with a grandmother. Because this is important also, women here are the primary caregivers usually. So as COVID was affecting mostly men also, we result with families that were the head of the house was a woman, and in many cases an older woman who didn't have a formal job. So the kid was starting to face the change of the home, adjusting to a new environment, also having less resources, because the caregiver didn't have the same resources as the parent had, for example. Yes, and with this thing of the financial aid the government was given, most of the caregivers, for example, I remember this grandmother didn't know how to make the request because it had to be made online, and she didn't know how to work with in the internet, how to upload documents. So who did the work? The kid. The orphan kid was the one who was on the phone with the social security, was the one who was uploading the documents, the death certificate of his mom, for example. Also, sometimes speaking with me on the phone because his grandmother didn't know how to explain to me some things. So I think that in many cases they have been the ones to face this work also, to make the request to the government to get a financial aid. It has to be a difficult moment for them.
Thank you for that, Lucero. And I'm seeing Maitri nodding a lot. I mean, of course, India, I mean, the estimates are there are some 3.5 million children lost a parent or primary, secondary caregiver. Tell us about what happened and when it became clear that that orphan children was a story that, as a journalist, it was important to cover.
So actually, I find a lot of similarities with what Lucero just said, because we were in an almost identical situation, if I may say so. So I would actually like to take you all back to May and June 2021. These 2 months were actually like nothing that India has ever seen before. Like on an average, we had at least 4,000 people who were dying every day, not just because of COVID-19, but also because they were not able to receive the medical intervention, that they very well deserved due to, a very overwhelmed healthcare system. So, during this period, social media was filled with desperate calls for action. Like, for example, there were calls for hospital beds, there were calls for ICU beds, there were calls for oxygen cylinders, medicines, jobs, food, and, just any basic need that people had. And amid all this, we also saw that there were calls, where people used to post on social media saying, please adopt this child who has been left, due to COVID-19. So, by mid-May, we saw a lot of posts on social media which is how we realized, because like Lucero said, till then this was not something that we were aware of, because for a lot of us this is the first pandemic that we are witnessing. This was not something that we knew, that we had to train our minds to see. So when we saw posts like this on social media, and I also have to tell you that these posts had all the details of these children. They had the names, their photos, their addresses, their phone numbers, where to reach them, how to reach them. While this was all well intentioned, or could have been well intentioned, we also cannot ignore the fact that this was putting these orphan kids at high risk of neglect, abuse, and exploitation as well. So at this point, I also have to mention that there was no direct response from the government. India does not have a child welfare system, so to say. We do have a women and child affairs ministry, but we have this agency called the Central Adoption Resource Authority, which takes care of adoption. But again, it does not take in children, and it only is a coordinating body. It is not a body that provides care. So this was what was happening, and exactly like how Lucero said, we also had no government response. We had the NGOs that stepped up, we had the activists that said stepped up, and we had the civil society that actually stepped up. And to just say that how many children in India actually lost their parents and were left orphaned, we will never really know, or we cannot really say. But the official data actually states that there were only 3,632 children who were left orphaned, in the sense who lost both their parents, or lost their single surviving parent at the time of pandemic. Now the immediate question we all have is, if 4,000 people, mostly adults, died every single day for 2 months, can it be possible that only 3,000 odd children were left orphaned? There is activists who are actually working in the space say that the actual number could be almost 30-40 times this number. So that's how many children are actually left orphaned. Now one reason for this undercount, and one very minor reason for this undercount, could also be the very strong family system in India, because a lot of these children who were left orphaned were taken in by their grandparents, were taken in by their aunts and uncles, basically extended families. But again, not everyone had this privilege. We at the Quint covered stories of this mother who had actually written a letter to the local orphanage, expecting that she knew that if she would contract COVID, she would end up dying. So she had a child with disability who was 40 years old. The child was 40 years old. So this mother, who was in her late 70s, penned a letter to the orphanage, requesting them, in the event of death, to please take in their child. There was also this family of 5 children who did not step out for almost 2 months, with only the eldest child stepping out to get food and the basic needs, because the family lost both their kids. So there are thousands and thousands of stories like this which were really being left untold. And again, another similarity with Peru was that the government did end up announcing an aid, which is when a lot of these stories also started coming out, because again, there was a lot of difficulty in accessing the aid as well. So which is why we thought it was really important to be telling these stories. One was to help them get government aid, and 2 was to also, like, a lot of NGOs and these people, and news organizations started collecting funds, so that if the government aid is not coming, in the meantime, whatever could be possible to get transferred to the grandparents, who were all, like, mostly beyond their retirement age, to take care of their children. So that's how I met the story of this child whom I did. When he was just a 9-year-old child, and he lost both his parents within a span of 12 days, and he had grandparents to take them in. But one thing that they said to me, the initial call I made to them, they said, we really want him to talk to you because he's not shed a single tear since he lost his parents. So that was, again, beyond all these financial help that we could give. These are also stories that needed to be told, because like Lucero said, we don't know what's going to happen 10 years down the lane to these children.
Thank you, Maitri. We'll come back also to what it means to do reporting with children in these conditions. There's also a chat around the ethics of that. There's a question around the ethics of that. But I'd like to come back to Charles first. You heard these experiences now in India and Peru regarding COVID, but you've been studying the issue for many years. How does it all how do these two specific realities that maybe are particularly exaggerated because of the death toll that COVID created in these countries, how do they compare to the big picture globally of how orphans are cared for?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that if I could just stay with the little picture for a moment. When you see people stepping up to care for children, it happens in a number of different ways. So some people feel really committed to the kids. They may have a pre-existing relationship with the kids, and they really are highly motivated to do it. And sometimes, frankly, they do it quite grudgingly. They have lots of problems of their own and taking on the burden of caring for other children. And that makes a huge difference for the child, whether they're being accepted and essentially treasured and cared for, or whether they're just another burden for the family to be tolerated at best. And that's hugely important in the long-term outcome with regard to well-being for these kids. In terms of how children who are cared for away from their parents, probably the most common form of care for kids around the world is to put them in group care, essentially in institutions. And we know that that's an unfortunate intervention because it is so harmful, potentially harmful at least to their development. And I'm also struck that it's often countries which have the fewest resources that are most reliant on institutional care, which we also know is a more expensive form of care than having the children cared for in families. And maybe some of the journalists who participate in this have answers as to why that is. Why would the poorest countries invest in the most expensive form of care? I can only speculate that it may take a sort of sufficient amount of psychological well-being in the population for there to be broad support for the idea of taking in other people's children. And in a situation in which everyone is stressed and feels stretched to their limits, the idea of that is just not very appealing. And it's much easier to have the children placed somewhere where essentially the larger public doesn't have to think about it, doesn't have to worry about it. But it's hard to know. The best estimates we have are somewhere between 4 and 9 million children are in institutions worldwide. So the best guess would be around 5 million, maybe 5 or 6 million. Other ways that children are cared for is basically no care. They're just sort of left on their own. And we know those children are in very dire circumstances. And then other places have invested in foster care or some version of foster care as an alternative. Even there, although we know that foster care is better than institutional care, the quality of foster care matters a lot. And the same rules apply. That is, if this is kind of thought of as factory work, and that children are just parcels that are coming in and going out, and don't get the kind of psychological investment that they so desperately need for healthy development, then foster care can be problematic. So we have a long way to go, and there's no place that I'm aware of that has really solved this problem. There are places that are at various points along the way to providing kids what they actually need when they don't have parents to care for them.
Thank you for that. Lucero and Maitri, I'm interested in hearing a little bit about this idea of, what happens with children once they're orphaned. I mean, you've already sort of given a bit of an idea, but let's go a little bit deeper. Lucero, maybe I'll come to you first. I mean, of course, the government aid that came in was to help those family members that had taken in children, from what I understand. But did you come across any stories of families that were reluctant to take in these children, where it consisted just in an extra, maybe financial pressure? Did this government aid actually help in that sense?
Well, there are different outcomes, no? As they said, there were children who were orphaned because of the pandemic, and they were sent to foster care, for example, because it's a different situation. And in that case, for example, the government aid, financial aid, wasn't directed to them because, as the government said, they are already being taken care in an institution that provides for them in that sense. We don't know much about what happened with the children in the foster care, actually, because there is not a register where we can see exactly how many children that are there are because of the pandemic. It's data we ask for the government, but the government only administers part of the institutions that provide foster care. Most of them are private, and we can ask them that information. They have no obligation to give us that information, actually, only the government.
Sorry, Lucero, are you talking about foster care, or are you talking about institutions like orphanages?
It's called, like, here it's called albergue. It's like
I guess there are institutions, yeah. So I guess some are private and some are public, and so there's no clear data of how many children ended up there because of COVID. Okay.
Yeah, there is an approximation that currently there are like 5,000 children in these institutions, private and public, but we don't know how many of them are there because of the pandemic, because of their parents or caregivers died from COVID. So it's a situation we actually wanted to approach, but they are not separated from the rest of the children. So as we have been told that they are being treated like any other children, and these institutions receive actually children that are there for many reasons, because they had been victims of sexual violence, because their mothers, for example, have been killed, and they were their only caregivers for many reasons, or because they were living in the streets even. So there are different situations, and we have the hypothesis that probably this population of kids that lost their parents or caregivers because of the COVID are being treated with the same approach that different kids that have different problems. So this could create even further difficulties for them in the future. There is a program from the government where there are families that receive kids who doesn't have their parents or caregivers, but it's still a small program. There are not many families who do that. As I said, it's not a custom here, and I've been thinking about that. Why we why we use the more expensive treatment? Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. My only thought there is that we don't have a sense of collective, as where we see a children in need, we think, okay, I'm gonna receive them. That is not in the thought of the society here, sadly.
And so the aid package that was then put in by the government was mainly for relatives who took in the children?
Exactly.
Okay.
They were like the administrators of the money that the government gives. Uh, every 2 months, they received some of money. It's a small amount of money, actually. It started as a financial aid, and it actually, because of the request of many organizations, NGOs, it has developed into a more complete aid, actually. Nowadays, the children receive the financial aid, and also psychological aid, social aid, educational aid. They are offered scholarships, no? And there is a lot of more supervision because, of course, the relatives that are administrating this amount of money, they have to. The government has to be sure that this money is actually being used to provide for the children. We've seen a lot of improvement, slow improvement, but still, it's been a year. Also, the government decided at the start of this year that they were going to give this aid not only for the children who lost their parents because of COVID, but to all orphans, actually, because we couldn't tell actually in the pandemic which ones were for COVID, which ones were for different reasons. Not every person who died from COVID has a certificate that says so. So it was actually had no sense to make that difference, and the government realized that, fortunately, and they've given this aid. They are offering this aid to everyone, but of course, as people ask for it, the people has to request it. It's not that the government is looking for them. Actually, they are receiving the requests and providing for them. It's been creating a register of children and teenager orphans in Peru, which is a big improvement because it will allow to continue seeing these children who become teenagers, who become adults, to see their path and to provide them aid in every step.
Thank you. And Maitri, what about the situation in India?
Yeah, so India actually has a little bit of a peculiar situation. So according to official data, there are 31,000 individuals or couples who are, willing to adopt, but there are only 7,000, children who are eligible to be adopted in the central agency through like the government adoption. So again, we do not know. This data is from December 2021, which means like after the pandemic. But right now, again, the same issue, we do not know how many of them are children who have lost their parents due to COVID or due to other reasons. Now, about the aid, India has a federal system of government, which means there is one government at the center, and then there are different state governments. Now, the center has announced that each child who has been orphaned due to COVID will receive an aid of 1 million when they attain like 18 years of age. Like right now, they will receive the aid. It will be in the bank as a fixed deposit, but they'll be able to claim it once they are 18 years of age, or a couple of years before that, which could be like used for their studies. But the state governments, there are different rules for different state governments. There are some state governments which provides a direct transfer month to the either to the child's bank account or to the next of kin. There are some state governments which provide after at intervals of fixed periods of time. So again, there are these different rules which govern different states. So that is one of the, and in the recently concluded budget, the government also announced that children who were orphaned by COVID will also receive free education up to the age of 18. So now, again, like in Peru, because I do find like a lot of commonalities between these two countries, it is for the parent, it is for the grandparents to apply for the aid. The government is not coming and looking at who has lost their parent, and the aid is not coming to the people directly. It is only when the children or their next of kin approach for aid is it being like distributed. Now again, why again telling these stories is important, because in a lot of cases, due to intermediaries, there have also been cases where, you know, the said amount is not directly going to the children in need. So this is again something that we are finding through our stories. And to answer your other question about, you know, are there families that are not willing to take children in? Now we do not know that yet. I have personally not come across a story like that, you know, a child like that who has not been able to, you know, find, who has family, who has extended family, but is not being taken in. That is not the case. But there are cases where the entire family and the entire extended family has been wiped off. So you know, in that situation, then the child is, you know, referred to an orphanage that is, you know, operating in the area.
Okay, so we're talking about a lot of difficulties, of course, you know, on top of the trauma of losing a parent, then there's all these loops, bureaucratic loops, and inadequate sort of structures, like inadequate government aid. So Charlie, I'd like to come back to you because when we talked before this webinar, you wanted to make sure that, you know, especially us journalists that may not have a scientific background, get the right idea of like the difference between trauma, so the effects of trauma on these children, and the effects of psychosocial neglect and deprivation, and why that is an important distinction to make when we're talking about when we're reporting on orphans. And you need to unmute again. There you go.
Sure. So the distinction is this. The trauma is the presence of a threatening stimulation. The fear circuitry in the brain takes an intense hit from exposure to violence, from physical abuse, from sexual abuse, from some overwhelmingly frightening event. And that leads to changes in the brain, particularly if it's not just a one-time thing, but a more prolonged exposure over time can lead to changes in the parts of the brain that are involved in processing experiences of fear. So the fear detector in the brain, the amygdala, this little almond-shaped part of the brain that's responsible for, can get hypersensitized and become overactive and begin to respond in non-threatening situations as if the individual were still threatened. And sort of the classic clinical manifestation of this is what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. On the other hand, what neglect represents, at least in terms of psychosocial neglect, and particularly for young children, is the absence of input to the developing central nervous system that's absolutely essential for the brain to develop in a healthy way. So it's the absence of input as opposed to the presence of threatening, harsh, or punitive kind of input. And that effect is actually more pervasive across all areas of the brain, because what we know now is that the human brain is born, if you will, anticipating getting certain types of input at certain critical periods. And when the input comes in before that critical or sensitive period or after that sensitive period, it doesn't have nearly the same effect as if it occurs when it's expected by the brain. And so when that happens, when the needed input, whether it's language input or cognitive stimulation or nurturance, isn't available to the brain at a time when it's developing, then brain development can go awry and the individual can be predisposed to have many, many subsequent problems. So, of course, in various complex conditions of adversity, both things may occur. Children can be traumatized and neglected. So both things can occur, but it's important to think about them differently in terms of their effects on the developing brain.
Right. And so we're talking, for example, about the trauma of seeing your parents sick and then dying, but then depending on what happens to you in terms of care later, you may be severely neglected in the sense that you don't have anyone hugging you, loving you, caring for you, talking to you, especially in situations, as you were saying, of children placed in institutions, in group settings,
Yes,
where there is possibly less of a figure that may be of reference to them, right?
that's correct.
Right. So I'd like to open this up a little bit because Juana Sandu is here and she's a Romanian reporter and she's working on orphans, another aspect of orphans, not orphans of COVID-19, but orphans of femicides. So with a more, with a different set of difficulties. And Juan, I'd like to come to you to ask you about what you've seen from your experience reporting on orphans of femicides that overlaps with what you've been hearing from the very specific situation of COVID-19.
Okay, thank you so much. This is a fascinating discussion, and I become interested in this because I'm reporting about domestic violence for a couple of years, actually for 7 years, and I wrote a story about the femicide that happened here in Bucharest in a kindergarten, where also the children of this couple were playing there. So I stayed in touch with the victim's family, who are raising now these two children, young children back then. They moved to a different city than the other one where they were raised by their parents. And I've discovered that this family, so these new caregivers, an aunt and actually two aunts, because the siblings were separated and were raised by two different aunts, the sister's victim. These families aren't at all supported in Romania, actually, and we are not talking about the orphans of femicides here in Romania. We have approximately 50 cases of femicides every year. We don't have any numbers about the children who became orphans and who are having this big trauma because they are losing actually their both parents in this kind of way. So that's why I begin to report on other family as well, and all the child psychotherapy, bureaucratic problems with adoption or other kind of financial aids, emotional support for adoptive parents are all things that these people are trying to solve on their own. And sometimes they are not even asking for support from the authorities because they are feeling very, very shamed. They are feeling a lot of shame about this. And also the state doesn't do anything, even though there is legislation. So there is the legislation that can help them. I was one friend of the victim that took in the child, approximately a teenager girl, said to me that when the child told her about what happened, because she was a witness of the murder, this friend said that I couldn't take it anymore. I just lied on the floor and cried. I've heard about a lot of these worries of these adoptive parents. They are worried that they can't tell the truth when the children became teenager, and they have to tell the truth because if they are so young children, they don't know actually the truth. They just know that their father disappeared and the mother is dead because of an accident. So I wanted to ask you, Charles, and the other journalists. I have two questions that are very important, and I think important also for this conversation. I was wondering what kind of what kind of information or what kind of social intervention is helpful for these adoptive parents who are taking in a child with such trauma. And also for us journalists, I have a lot of exercise interviewing domestic violence survivors, but I never interviewed a teenager or a child about or an orphan child or teenager about this, and maybe I will do that someday. And I was asking what we need to know in order to do this with empathy and consideration of this traumatic incident.
Thank you for that one. Charlie, can we come to you first, maybe about the social interventions and then interviewing, and then we'll open it up about the ethics also of interviewing and come back to the question in the chat.
Okay. So the first point I would make, I guess, is that obviously the murder of a child's mother can be a devastating experience, but it's almost certain that it was preceded by a great deal of trauma. So it's unlikely that the first violent event was the mother's murder. It was likely preceded by months or probably years of violent interchanges between parents. And parents who are involved in a violent relationship have a tendency to minimize the effects on the children, perhaps for their own psychological reasons. But we know that children are far more affected by violence exposure than what parents tell us. There was an interesting study a few years ago where they took infants second half of the first year of life and they put them in a functional MRI scanner, and they played recordings of gibberish, neutral gibberish, angry gibberish, and positive gibberish while the babies were sleeping, because the only way to have babies in a functional MRI is they have to be asleep. So they're sound asleep. And then they had the mothers of those babies report the degree of conflict in their relationship with their partners. And the children whose mothers reported the highest level of conflict had brains that reacted very intensely during the angry gibberish, but not the positive or the neutral gibberish. So even when they're sleeping, they're capable of responding to angry, conflicted, violent kind of stimulation in the environment. And of course, many times the kids are direct witnesses. They're not just sleeping through these things. So that's the first point I would make. The second point is that children who are exposed to intimate partner violence, and certainly violence that ends in femicide, are very likely to be severely traumatized. And we have good treatments, even for preschool children who are severely traumatized, that are evidence-based, that are quite helpful. But the question is access. How do you access it? And many times the surviving family members, whether it's because of shame or just because of the pain of thinking about trauma in their children, want to push it aside, encourage the children not to think about it, which actually is not helpful. It's potentially harmful because it says to the children, there's something threatening to other people about these things that happen to me, and so they don't get the treatment that they need. So a big priority should be getting good evaluations done, mental health assessments done of children who are in these situations, and then getting them the treatment that is needed. And I know only a little bit about the Romanian system, but I know that there are some major centers at universities that specialize in the kinds of treatment that are very helpful for children who've experienced serious trauma.
Thank you. That was really important and interesting. And so I wonder whether we can now address the idea of how we interview or how we can approach a child that has gone through this kind of trauma. A lot of the reporting experience I have is about early childhood. So usually my way to go about things is to become close with the family and then just observe the child in lateral ways, maybe playing with the child, but never sort of asking questions. And that's always like one of the guidelines that I follow myself. But I love to hear from the three of you, you know, from Juana, Maitri, and Lucero, briefly about, you know, whether you had to interview orphan children, how you approached the interview. And as we're at it, I'd love to ask what Alia, I hope you're pronouncing your name right, but what are the ethical concerns you have when you're thinking about doing these interviews? So Maitri, shall I come to you first, and then we'll do a quick round. We have another 10 minutes left, so take a couple of minutes, please.
Yeah. So I think, like you said, the first thing is to not, go to the child directly and ask what happened or how it happened. It's very important to do your homework. Talk to everyone whom the child is close to in this, aspect. Talk to the grandparents, talk to, the aunts and uncles, understand what happened. Do not wait for that to, come from the child itself, because, one of the biggest concerns that I have is to not, trigger the trauma, not to ask them, questions, not to make them relive sort of what they went through, irrespective of how expressive they are, how expressive they are not. I think it's not very nice to sort of ask, what happened or how do you feel, questions like this. So understand what happened, by talking to all the other stakeholders, who are there, so that we can frame our questions in such a way. For example, when I knew that the child that I was going to interview had not shed a tear, while a lot of people were saying, oh, he's so brave, he did not shed even a single tear. But I think we, as people who are talking to children who've gone through a lot, should also understand that it's a repressed trauma, and how he's not talking or shedding tear because maybe he does not want to talk about it. But when I met the child, he was saying like, I want to talk about it, but I want to remember them in a very happy way. I want to remember the happy memories that I have with my parents. So I had to change my questions in such a way, where I asked him, what is your favorite memory about your parents? What is the thing that you miss the most about your parents? Just to reframe questions in such a way. That was one thing. And the second thing is, while getting the story, I think as journalists, we all get so caught up in, going there and getting the story, that we sometimes forget to, put the importance on the survivor. So while getting our stories are clearly very important to us, it should not be about the survivor. It should not, we cannot, no matter how much time you've spent with the family, with the child, there is only certain things and there are only certain boundaries, that we can reach and we could, get. So another major ethical concern that I have is to always be honest about what your intentions with the story are. Like, what are you seeking to get, and what do you seek to, also give back through your story? So that was one thing that I was thinking about, while I was preparing for this set of interview. And another thing that I did, and I don't know how helpful it will be, is to, run the questions through a senior editor or a fellow journalist. There is no harm in sort of doing that. The more opinions we have, the more rounds that we ask before you directly go to a child and put a mic to their face, that is something that I thought was very important to think about. And I think in the current climate, just doing the story is also not enough. So another concern that I had, like, is also to make sure that the story reaches the right set of people, so that the effort that I put in telling the story, and again making the child go through everything, no matter how concerned we are, how, by doing the story, I feel we are somehow making the child also relive certain parts of it. So at the end of the day, what kind of benefit is that going to have? So once the story is done, it's not like, okay, I'm going to forget this kind of thing. So I think it's very important to take the story to the right people and stay in touch with the child, so that we could sort of follow up, or if not, just be there for the child. So those were my biggest concerns in, in approaching the stories.
Thank you. Lucero, do you want to go next?
Yes, I agree with something Maitri said about why ask how do you feel, and instead of that think of different questions, because I think that it also worked with the adults. We got more elaborated responses asking about their routine, how their routine had changed after the loss. For example, for the children, what do you do now? What did you do then? And those changes actually were more revealing to us about what they were experiencing the grief. Because, for example, they used to spend their afternoons with their parents. Now they are isolated in their room after classes and they don't speak to anyone. So that is very revealing, and they don't have to tell us how they feel and elaborate on that. That can be hurtful, and instead they talk about actions. No, I do this, I do that. It was a way we could get what we wanted, but not being too invasive, I believe. Also, as Maitri said, being honest with the family, because we always the contact with the children were with the family first, with the caregiver, with the parent. At least I didn't have a time alone with the child in any moment. They were very protective, and also most of the interviews I did were via telephone or Zoom. Because of the pandemic, the act of receiving a stranger in their homes were not something they wanted. So being honest with what are we going to publish, if they are okay with that, what they want to reveal, what they don't want to reveal. And also, because of many of the questions I made were regarding the financial aid, and there was hope from many of the families that what they were telling me was going to help them to get the financial aid faster. And I had to be very, very clear and careful with that, in telling them that I wasn't part of that process, and that my only participation in that was to get to publish about the problems they were having with the financial aid. And that was the only thing we could do, that we were transmitting their complaints to the government, and that we were hoping for the best. But we had to be very, very clear and careful in not creating hope, because we didn't have the participation in that.
Thank you for that, Lucero. Is there my 3-year?
Yeah, I just want to
yes.
add something to that, we actually put out a call to action kind of story where we asked people to come and tell us their stories. So when we went back to them and when we shot with them, like she said, we had to be very clear, in saying that we are not raising funds. We are telling your story, and we are going to, give our email address. So whoever wants to sort of contribute, we will give them your bank account directly, because as media organization and the kind of scrutiny that is happening right now, we could not, and we were not in any place to promise them that this is the amount you will get or something. So yeah, so that was something that had to be clarified very clearly, to the guardians well before.
Thank you. And Juana, is there something that you'd like to add to what you've been hearing and sort of your thoughts about how to approach orphans? Maybe in a minute, and then I'll come back to Charlie for final thoughts.
Thanks. Actually, that was my question, because I never interviewed orphaned children, only families, and I did the same as you told, with being honest first of all. So I'll let Charles, maybe he has some tips for us journalists in approaching children who are orphans or teenagers.
Yeah, Charlie, and I'd love to hear, if you do have any tips that you think it might be useful for journalists, and if you've seen any sort of bad examples that might be worth sort of bringing up.
Well, I can't think of a lot of examples where I'm directly involved with someone who's involved with the media. I think these stories are obviously extremely important in bringing attention and often pressure to people in need. And so from that standpoint, it's very important. I think, your panelists have been very sensitive in reflecting on some of the risks as well as things that can be done to try to deal with those risks, because there are real risks of exploitation of children who don't fully grasp what is, what's being asked of them or what's going to happen to it and that sort of thing. So I think using the families as a gateway makes a lot of sense to me in terms of what they allow and don't allow. And children have some capacity to protect themselves, so they may not be interested in talking about things. But generally, the family will know that and will let you know, I think.
So thank you very much for this. This is a very difficult topic to cover, of course, but thank you so much for sharing your experiences as journalists, and Charlie, for your insights in trying to help us understand as journalists how to, what the real effects are on the developing brain, especially. And thank you for everybody who also assisted and for your questions. I left a link to the webinar series where you can also find out about the 2 other upcoming webinars on climate and on diverse families. And I just want to thank you all again, and have a good afternoon, evening, day, depending on where you are.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.